Hello, in this video I'm going to detail the process of how to derive 4-note chords from the 6 tonal scales and suggest a way to organize them in order to systematically investigate them. There are 43 4-note chords that are primary, meaning that all of the other chords relate to these 43 as inversions. However, 8 of these can be classified as dissonant types because they contain a cluster, which sounds like this. This cluster is 3 notes with a separation of 2 half steps apiece. So if we look at set number 4-1, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, or you could look at it as root, minor second, major second, minor third, and it has 2 clusters kind of put on top of one another. So 0, 1, 2 and 1, 2, 3 are both clusters. This makes it significantly dissonant enough to not have any kind of tonal center or tonal relation. The 8 dissonant types are listed here. These are the 8 sets, and you can see that each one of the sets has a 0, 1, 2 set in it. So this structure, this dissonant structure, this cluster makes it very difficult to be heard as a tonal harmony. So if we set aside these 8 dissonant types, this leaves 35 4-note chords that can be heard as tonal. There are 6 primary tonal scales that I investigated in the harmonic transformation series, and you can see how those were all abstracted from or derived from the major scale. And we can derive 4-note chords from the tonal scales or 4-note chords that are diatonic to the scales. So these are the 6 primary tonal scales that we're going to be using. For the majority of this video, I'm just going to be utilizing the major scale, and you're going to be able to see how this applies to the other scales as well. So if we take the major scale, which is actually set in Fortean numbers, set number 7-35, we can abstract or derive 4-note scales or 4-note chords from this 7-note scale. So starting with C as the root, and 2 and 4 and 5, right? So we can just start to kind of mathematically create these permutations. So this becomes the root, the second, the third, and the fourth. Now, here, when we're talking about second, third, and fourth, I'm referring to the second, third, and fourth notes in the scale that are not necessarily a second in terms of an interval, or a third, either a major or a minor third, or a perfect fourth, or so on. It just so happens that these are related in this way with a major scale. But when I'm talking about the root, the second, the third, the fourth, I'm talking about the root of the 7-note scale, the second note, the third note, the fourth note. So these aren't necessarily depicting the specific interval of a second, a third, or a fourth, but just designating the note names from the scale. So we can then move and see that there's a 4-note chord with the root, the second, the third, and the 5th note, and the 6th note, and the 7th note. And then we can move on and say, what about, okay, the root, the 3rd note, the 4th note, the 5th note, and so on. So just mathematically, we can start to kind of derive all of these different permutations of these various different 4-note chords, all based on the root of C. And so there turns out to be 20 4-note structures derived from the 7 notes of the scales. So we can then apply this to every single note in C. So we can derive each of these 4-note chords from each of the modes. So for right now, though, let's just look at these 20 4-note structures just based on C. It turns out that there are 5 groups of 4-note structures derived from 7-note scales with inversions. So each of these different 4-note chords relates to kind of a primary structure or primary group. they're all related in terms of inversions. So the chord that is the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh is also related to the chord that is the root, the third, the fifth, and the sixth. So seventh chords and sixth chords turned out to be inversions of one another. So we can group these together and see that these are actually all of the different permutations of 4-note chords that are derived from 7-note scales. Now, for our purposes, I'm going to use this S group designation. So this first group, I'm just going to designate as S1. These are seventh chords. S2, in Mick Goodrick's books, the Chord Almanacs, he designates this as the triad over bass note 2 group, or the TBN2 group. What I am designating as group 3, or S3, he designates as the triad over bass note 1, or the TBN1 group. S4, he designates as 4-part fourth chords. And what I'm designating as S5, he refers to as spread clusters. These are the only groups of 4-note chords available from the major scale. Whatever you want to call these groups, you can make up whatever name you want. The names really shouldn't restrict you or keep you prisoner from being able to use them. What is most useful is just that you see these as related groups, so you can start to investigate them in ways that you understand their relationships. So again, don't get so caught up in names. I'm just using the names that were from the Schillinger system, the S groups. So let's start with S1. So the S1 group turns out to be, if we look at the primary structure, is the first, the third, the fifth, and the seventh of the scale. So all of these listed here are the modes of the major scale, or 7-35. And what you see on the right-hand side is the set name for each of the 4-note chords that are derived from the first, the third, the fifth, and the seventh of this scale structure. So one of the other things I want to point out is that you'll see that 4 of them are bolded. Those are primary set structures. So in other words, those are the ones that we see that are not repeating as such. So we can see that 4-27, for example, does not repeat. 420 appears in a prime form from the actual major scale structure, and then repeats again. You can see it repeating it at the fifth degree here listed, but it would be on the fourth degree. And then we have 4-26, which repeats twice. So the understanding is that when you look at it and see that it's bolded, you see that is kind of the primary one, and the other ones are just repetitions of those primary sets. So if we look at this seventh chord and create a chord scale from voicing group 1, so this is using voicing group 1, this is the S1 chord structures, the seventh chords, and they sound like this. Now, this is, of course, not functional. This is just a chord scale. And if we want to look at, well, how do you start to name these groups? So one of the things that we need to understand is that function is always a matter of context. What chord is coming before? What chord is coming after? Where are you hearing the chord in the phrase? All of that is going to dictate kind of how we're hearing a tonal center or a center of gravity. So, for example, we can see that a seventh chord can also function as a sixth chord, right? So what I've shown here is that we have the set 4-20 and we have the structure, But what I'm showing is that you can kind of start to look at this chord as being named different things depending on the root or the assumed root that you're hearing in any particular context. So context is always going to dictate how you're potentially going to hear the functioning of this chord. So, you know, as we're kind of playing around with these, especially in the next video and in a series that I'm going to do after this, we'll see that these different chords can be called different things depending on how you're using them. So I've bolded some of the names of some of the chord types. For example, this is probably, you know, is going to be heard as a major seventh chord by most people, but we can see that it will function in different ways depending on the context. So set dash 426, the structure, that the note names are here C, D, F, and A. However, based on or depending on what root you're hearing it as and how this is voiced, and the context is really going to determine the function. In other words, this could be heard as a minor seventh chord, but it can also be heard as a major sixth chord. So 4-27, we can hear this as a dominant chord, but we can also hear this as an altered dominant chord from various different assumed roots. And 4-27, we can hear this as a minor sixth chord. We can also hear this as a minor 7 flat 5 from D. So again, I have created a list of all of the different sets with all of the different names that you can kind of play around with and see how you're hearing these structures. So now we look at S2, or the triad over bass note 2 group, as McGoodrick calls it. And this is just using the first, the second, the fourth, and the seventh of the scale structure. So when we put these together, we get this. This is a chord scale. Again, we can use any root we want to start from, and of course, all of the inversions are going to be related to all of these S groups, and I've included that in a handout in the description, and linked to in the description. But for our purposes, we just want to hear this in terms of what is this sounding like. So this is the voicing 1 group for S2. And these are all of the different primary sets from S2 and the potential names that we could use to call or refer to these chords in the various different contexts. So again, we'll see that 4-14, we could call this a major 7/6 with no fifth. We could also call this a minor ninth, or a minor chord with an added ninth. We can also see this as a minor triad with a bass note. In this particular situation with C, D flat, F, and B flat, we can look at it as B flat minor over C. So again, whatever you call it, you know, you're not going to be shouting out the chord names as you're playing a chart necessarily to the audience. So a lot of it is going to be, how do you want to communicate this to the other musicians, or how do you think about it, the chord? How do you hear the chord? That can help us to kind of investigate various different harmonies. So the third group, the S3 group, is referred to as the triad over bass note 1 chords by McGoodrick. And here we have the root, the second, the fifth, and the seventh of the scale structures. And we see the 4 primary sets bolded on the right-hand side: 4-29B, 4-14B, 4-22B, and 4-13B. And if we create a chord scale based on the third group, it sounds like this. So these are the different 4 primary sets. We can see that we can depict these as triads over bass notes. We could also issue various different names based on different roots or assumed roots dependent on their context. And this is the fourth group. These are referred to as four-note fourth chords by Mick Goodrick, and we have here the root, the fourth, the fifth, and the seventh of the scale structure. And this is a chord scale from S4 in voicing group 1, and sounds like this. Here are the different 4 sets that are utilized in set 4 or group 4, and the various different names we can utilize in referring to these chords or hearing these chords. And here is set group 5, or the structures, the chord structure, chords of the fifth group, which Mick Goodrick refers to as spread clusters. This has the root, the second, the third, and the seventh. And if we create a chord scale from voicing group 1, from S group 5, it sounds like this. And here are the sets. Now, with all the sets, I've used all of them based on C. Obviously, in the chord scales, they're not all based on C, but just to keep a uniform consistency in terms of understanding how the note names are used and so on, I've just tried to simplify this as much as possible. If you're utilizing any particular structure, you can transpose this in any way you want. So that we can derive 20 of the 4-note chords from the major scale. And being that there are 35 tonal 4-note chords, that means that over half of them come from the major scale. And this is one of the arguments for why we should just really start exploring major first, because that's going to give us most of our primary material. And then we can continue that process for the other 5 remaining tonal scales, and it ends up yielding all of the 35 4-note chords. So one of the reasons why those 6 primary tonal scales are so useful is because they truly yield all of the potential 35 4-note chords that we can hear as tonal. If you want to start exploring those 8 dissonant sets, I've included that in one of the files in the description. So here are the files that are all referenced in the description and with a link. All 4-note chords sorted with corresponding set names. There's a file for the 8 dissonant set structures. You can start to look at those and play around with those if that's the color that you want to go for. The 6 primary tonal scales and their structures, all the S group chords derived from each of the 6 tonal scales, and also a file of the 35 tonal set structures with possible chord name functions from various roots. So thank you so much. I hope that this has been helpful. Sorry about the voice. I'm just getting over some bronchitis, but wanted to go ahead and put this out and get this together. So take care, and thanks for listening.